Thank you very much for coming today. And let me tell you a little bit who I am and what we're going to do today. My name is David Schultz, and I'm a professor of political science at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Minnesota is located in the middle of the United States, in the most northern part, bordering on Canada. And I'm in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is part of Minneapolis, St. Paul, an area of about 3 million people. And supposedly we're one of the coldest cities in the United States, but nowhere near as cold as Moscow, I don't think. And what I want to do today is to talk about, as the title indicates, 100 days to go, what comes next in the American presidential election. And so what we're going to try to do today is to give you a little bit of an overview of what's happened so far in the presidential election process in the United States and what to think about as we go into the next approximately 100 days before the election. Now, I should also indicate to you a couple of other things as we're getting started here. 2 or 3 things. One, if you have questions, please do submit them. I'm more than happy to take questions. And in fact, I'm going to leave time at the end of the presentation so that there's plenty of time for you to ask me questions. I suspect I'll talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then leave opportunity for you to ask questions about this or other aspects about American politics, or whatever you want to go in terms of your conversation. The other thing I want to mention, some of you may have listened to my last talk about 2 months ago or about a month ago, and I sincerely wish I could be in Moscow talking to you at this point. I've been in Moscow I think about 7 or 8 times. I love the city. I love the people. I have my favorite places that I've been to. But again, I hope at some point to be able to return and to see all of you in person. And I'll have some contact information again. But if after today's presentation, you want to contact me, my email is there, dschultz@hamline.edu. And I will give it to you again at the end of the presentation. So let's get started in terms of where we're going to head next. So we'll do some introduction and background here, just so you know what I'm going to be trying to talk about right now is that I'm going to describe the current state of the U.S. presidential election process. I should let you know that even people in the United States are confused oftentimes about how we do our elections. Every country in the world runs their elections in a very different way, which means we're always confused about how somebody else does something. So I'm going to try to give you some idea about, again, the overview and again, the current status of our election. In the process, I need to talk about some things that may very well be very unique to the United States. I need to talk about a little bit what's called a political convention. And this is going to be important to understand when we think about that the Republican Party just had a convention a couple of weeks ago in which Donald Trump officially became the Republican Party candidate for president. And in the process, we need to explain the Democratic National Convention, which happens later in August, in why that's also important. Okay, we're also going to talk a little bit about today why Joe Biden withdrew from running for president of the United States, because many people thought he was going to continue to be the candidate. Then we're going to talk a little bit about who Kamala Harris is, because Kamala Harris is currently the vice president of the United States, and we presume, we think that she will be the Democratic Party candidate for president, although it's not official yet. So we're going to talk about why that's not official yet and why that needs to come back to our discussion all about party conventions. Somewhere in the process here, we'll probably discuss a little bit about what vice presidents do, and then indicate who Kamala Harris might pick for her vice president and whether that matters. And then talk about, again, also what's going to happen over the next 100 days. And the reason why we are saying the next 100 days is that the official election for president of the United States takes place on November 5th, 2024. And so that's going to be the last day of voting. But we're going to talk a little bit about what's going to lead up to that. So we have a lot of things we need to cover here today. And again, I really do invite lots of questions at some point, whether it's about this or a host of other things going on in terms of American politics right now. So here are some of the most important points. Again, I want you to understand, and I'm going to develop them later. So this is kind of like giving the opening here, the opening, so you know where I'm going to go here. Okay. One of the things I'm going to talk about is that there are several stages that the U.S. presidential elections go through. And we're going to talk about those different stages and what they mean and what happens during them. Also, in the United States, our presidential elections are governed by several sets of rules. In your country, you may have one set of rules passed by your national government that determine how elections happen, how a whole bunch of different things occur during a campaign. But in the United States, our political parties have their own rules regarding some issues, regarding who gets to be the party nominee or candidate for office. The U.S. Constitution also factors in terms of the Constitution has some rules or mandates regarding the elections. U.S. national law, that is laws passed by our national legislature, our Congress, also become important, as well as individual state law. And when I refer to state law, what I mean are the individual states in the United States, such as New York or California or Florida or Minnesota, where I live. And the reason why I mention all of this is that for many Americans, it's also kind of confusing to understand our election process, because there's not sort of one place, one set of laws or rules or regulations to look to understand what's happening, but lots of different places and locations. And this makes it kind of confusing. All right. Eventually, I'm going to explain to you that the United States right now, as of today, on the 31st of July, is in what I would say is the third or fourth stage of a multi-stage presidential election process. Okay. I should also point out, and again, I'll explain this more in detail, no candidate officially has his or her party nomination until their political party votes on it. Again, I'll explain that in more detail in a few minutes here. And generally, the presidential candidate for each party gets to select their own vice presidential candidate. So again, major points. There's probably a couple of others I've left out, but this gets us most of the major things we want to think about here. Okay, so now let's think about the stages of the American presidential election process. Now, I hope you can read the screen here, but if not, clearly I will explain everything here. Now, I'll also tell you that for many Americans, they think the American election process for president goes on far, far too long. And in some cases, I think that's probably correct. Our election process takes an incredibly long time. And it's partly because, of course, we're a very large country. So is your country. You know, ours is about 340 million people. We have 50 separate states. We live in a complex society, much like the Russian Federation is a complex one. And here we have a lot of other complexities in terms of individual states. We have very different media markets for communicating information. We have lots of different social media markets, newspapers, a lot of different parts to our political process. It's almost like having a machine with lots of gears and different parts operating in different ways. But I break it up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 7 different stages in terms of the process of actually electing the President of the United States. And the first part started back in November, roughly, of 2022. And in November of 2022, we had what was called our midterm elections. The President of the United States, according to our Constitution, serves a 4-year term. Once elected and sworn in, our president serves for 4 years. But halfway through the president's term, we have what's called midterm elections. And during the midterm elections, we have approximately 1/3 of all of the U.S. Senate. The U.S. Senate being the smaller, or I'll say the smaller chamber of our national legislature. Our Senate is composed of 100 senators, 2 from each of the 50 states. So in the midterm elections, approximately 1/3 are up for election. And what's called our lower house of our national legislature, which is called the U.S. House of Representatives, everybody is up for election. So roughly a little bit about 2 years ago, in November of 2022, we had the midterm elections where all of the House of the Representatives and about 1/3 of the Senate was up for election. And this happens, every midterm for a presidential midterm. And generally what happens after the midterm elections is that individuals who are thinking for running for president of the United States start what I call the informal process of running for president of the United States. And there's nothing sort of really official about this process at this point. It's individuals trying to see if they have support, see if they have, I'll say support, or the themes, or the messages, or the money to be able to run for president of the United States. Because of our complexity of our system, again, a very large political system, because of the 50 different states, because of all the different media markets, it's very complex to get people's attention in the United States. People are just distracted by lots of things, not just by the day-to-day going to work or going to school or spending time with their family, but Americans don't follow politics all that closely all the time. I'm unusual. I'm a political scientist, so I love this stuff. So what happens during this informal stage is individuals, if they're interested in running for president of the United States, start to travel across the country. They visit different states to see what kind of support they have. They start to try to raise money to run for president. Our political campaigns are essentially privately financed, and they're very expensive. To run for president of the United States, you probably have to raise at least 1 billion, and I say that with a B, 1 billion US dollars. That's a lot of money. Most of that money will be spent on television advertising, will be spent on hiring staff, campaigns, travel, a lot of different things. So during this informal stage, which for our purposes, this election cycle took place from roughly November 2022 until January of 2024. During that period, there were candidates traveling across the country for both the Democratic and Republican parties. We have 2 major parties in the United States. We have some other third and fourth and lesser parties, but the 2 major ones are Democrat and Republican. And starting roughly in November of 2022 to January 2024, so a little bit over a year, we had several candidates in the Republican Party who were interested in running for president. Donald Trump, who used to be president. We had the former UN ambassador, Nikki Haley. We had Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and several others. And they're all traveling across the country, trying to see if they have any support, trying to see if people are interested in them. Each of these candidates have messages or themes or stories they want to tell to talk about what they want to do if they get elected to office. But during that period, you had many, many candidates on the Republican side who were expressing interest. I think at one point, an interest in becoming president. I think at one point it might have been about 6, 7, 8, 9 candidates, but I'm forgetting the exact number. So again, they're traveling across the country, appearing on television, on radio, in the social media. On the Democratic side, initially, people thought that Joe Biden wasn't going to run for president again. In 2020, when he got elected to the presidency, he said he would be a transitional president. And we all thought, okay, he's only going to run one term, because there was concerns even back then about his age. He was, what, if I remember correctly, at that point, was he like, I think 78 years old? And there was concern, about that. And people thought, well, he'll run one term. If he wins, he'll serve one term, and then he'll declare he's not running again. His vice president was Kamala Harris. So many people thought 4 years ago, Biden, if was going to run with Kamala Harris as his vice president. Once he won, people thought he's a one-term president, and then he would not run for re-election again, and Vice President Harris would then run as a Democratic Party candidate. So there was no serious challenges on the Democratic Party side. Okay. But that's stage one. It's informal, no real rules governing anything. It's about getting your name out. It's about building support, defining themes for running for president. The second stage takes place beginning, and this year began roughly in January and went till about June of this year. And we call it the primary and caucus stage. And what happens across the United States for both the Democratic Party and for the Republican Party, and for others too, but I'm going to focus on the two major parties today, is that across all 50 states, there are what's called primary elections or caucuses, where people show up together, separated out by party, and they talk about who they want to have as president of the United States, or to be rather more accurately, who they want for their political party to be their presidential candidate. And so roughly between January and June of this year, across all the 50 states, starting in places such as Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, and then eventually all 50 states, is that both the Democratic and Republican parties were holding these conventions or caucuses. And the purpose of them was to elect delegates who would eventually attend the national political conventions for either the Democratic Party or the national convention for the Republican Party. These delegates would be pledged based upon how the voting occurred in the different states. These delegates would be pledged and required under party rules to support the candidate who won the votes or the caucuses in their state. And so by that, if in the state of New Hampshire, which happened, if Donald Trump did very well, which he did, and he won the election, and let's say won, I can't remember what the number was now, 40% of the vote, he would get 40% of the delegates. Those delegates would be pledged to vote for him at the National Republican Convention, which just took place about 2 weeks ago. Additionally, the same thing was happening with Joe Biden. So during this period from January to June, it's a combination of party rules and state law that really govern what happens. And what happened between January and June of this year is that Donald Trump eventually defeated his opponents and appeared to have enough delegates to win a vote at the Republican National Convention to be his party nominee for president. Joe Biden really didn't face very much in terms of serious challenges, and he too had enough delegates. So going into this stage here, we would have both Donald Trump and Joe Biden had more than enough delegates to be their party's nominee. The primary and caucus stage comes to an end sometime in June or July. We get to what's called the National Party Conventions. In July, a couple of weeks ago, the Republican Party had their convention, and the whole purpose there was to officially nominate Donald Trump as the party nominee, for Donald Trump to pick his vice president, and for the parties to do other business. In August, in about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the Democratic Party will be having their convention. And up until about 2 weeks ago, all of us thought it was going to be Joe Biden. He had won enough delegates through the primary and caucus stage. The presumption was he was going to be the presidential nominee, and his vice president, Kamala Harris, would be the vice president. Okay. Once we get past the conventions, we then get to what's normally called the general election stage of American politics. Usually in the United States, most Americans aren't paying that much attention to politics during the summer. School's out, people are on vacation, we're enjoying the nice weather. Generally in the United States, school goes back in session early September after an American holiday called Labor Day. And then at that point, the general election campaign occurs. At least let's say that's usually the unofficial start for it. Our election this year is on November 5th, 2024, or 5 November 2024, whatever you prefer. But because many states allow people to vote early, to vote remotely, to cast their ballots ahead of election time, in many places, voting starts at the end of September. So it's actually getting very, very close at this point. The general election takes place on November 5th. The whole purpose of the general election is 50 separate elections across 50 separate states to eventually choose delegates for the Electoral College. And I'm going to spend more time talking about the Electoral College in a few minutes here. But this is one of the most confusing topics in America. What is the Electoral College, why we have it, and so forth. I'm hoping to do a later program for you folks that talks about it in more detail. But the whole purpose of the general election is to pick delegates who will vote in the Electoral College to pick the president. That occurs on December 17th, 2024. Then on January 6th, 2025, next year, Congress counts the electoral votes just to make sure that somebody has enough votes to win the presidency. And then if so, our Constitution requires that the new president be sworn in on January 20th, 2025. So I basically break all of these different parts down into what I call the different stages of the American election process. There might be others who come up with a slightly different categorization, but I think this is pretty good in terms of what I come up with here. Okay, and so where we are right now is at the end of the primary and caucuses. We're getting ready for the national conventions. We've already had the Republican one, and the Democrat one is coming up, and we're probably getting ready to transition over to the general election campaign. Okay. As I mentioned to you, the primary and caucus stage across each of the 50 states, including the District of Columbia and U.S. territories, both the Republican and Democratic parties hold primaries and caucuses as candidates for president for each party to seek to win delegates for their national respective national conventions. Think of a parallel track here. The Democrats and the Republicans are each going through these 50-state process to try to eventually select their nominee. At this point, the parties are completely separate. It is about separate party rules, separate party actions that are going on. We're not voting for the president yet. It's the political parties themselves picking who they want to be their candidate. As I mentioned to you, Joe Biden and Donald Trump both won enough delegates in the Democratic and Republican parties, respectively, to win their party's nomination to run for president of the United States. So if we were having this conversation, if I were doing this presentation, let's say about 2.5 weeks ago, I would have said this election is turning into a rematch of what we saw 4 years ago in terms of the election. Now, this is where I had planned on playing an audio, but I can't. Okay. Up to this point, it's called, it's their party and they get to do what they want. Political parties are free and independent in the U.S., and they get to decide their own rules for doing their business, including the selection of candidates for the office of the president. So parties under our Constitution, under our Bill of Rights, have broad free speech and freedom of association rights to decide how they want to go about selecting delegates and people to attend their convention, and how they select the president of the United States. And under the, I'm going to get to a couple of questions over here in a second. Under our party rules for the Democratic and Republican parties, delegates to the conventions are required to vote for the way they are pledged in the first round for the national convention. Now, some of you, if you get a chance, if you can go to YouTube or somewhere else later, there's a famous song from the early 1960s. It's a great rock and roll song by Leslie Gore. It's called "It's My Party." Don't ask me to sing, but it goes, "It's my party. I'll cry if I want." I'm not going to sing because I can't. And I was going to play it at this point just to say it's their parties. They get to do what they want. Okay, so now we've got a few questions here. Are there any plans to implement electronic voting systems like those in use in other countries, such as in Russia? Not yet at this point. The parties themselves have opted to do so in some cases. But there's still a lot of concern in the United States all about the safety of electronic voting, concerns about whether it could be hacked, whether there's possibility that something could happen in terms of this. I mean, yes, our technology has evolved over time. If we go back to when I was a child, it was actually before I was born, I should say, it was paper ballots. At one point, it was still filling out paper ballots. At some point, it was that you would show up and there would be a curtain. What was it like? What is it? I'm going to call it here. You would enter a voting booth, pull a lever, the curtain would close, and you would mark on a big sheet who you wanted to vote for a candidate for president. But we've not gotten to the point yet. Like I said, like Russia, I think Estonia and a few other countries where you could use electronic voting, or you could use, like your cell phone to be able to vote. Again, we're very concerned in the United States about vote tampering, vote hacking. The concern that some have about what's called touchscreen voting, where you just show up and you touch the screen, is that Americans like the idea that a ballot still gets to be printed or still filled out, so that if there's a problem, if there's questions about the voting, there's actually a paper ballot to go back and recount. Because with electronic voting, if you had no paper ballot, if something had been hacked, if something had been done improperly, it might not be possible to detect it. So again, Americans are concerned about that issue, and that's why we're doing it the way we are. But anyhow, beyond today, if you ever get a chance, go listen to Leslie Gore's "It's My Party." Just a wonderful rock and roll song. You can dance to it too, which is a really cool part about it. That's what I like about it here. Okay, so now I should also point out, I'm going to do a slight diversion here. So we're at a point right now about the conventions, and both Biden and Trump, it was presumed that they were going to be the party nominees, officially getting the nominations at their party conventions. But just a quick side and important to understand here is that the American presidential campaign is only partially based upon the national popular vote. Our constitutional framers in 1787 devised a political system at a time when popular voting, general right to vote was not considered the norm in the world. In 1787, there was nothing that looked like democracies. We had what? We had probably what? Monarchies across the world, principalities. I don't know if we had military dictatorships back then, but the idea of letting average persons vote was a very strange idea. Letting people pick their own rulers was an incredibly strange idea back then. So they created this system called the Electoral College, that each state would pick electors who would pick the president of the United States. And how it plays out now in the United States is that what's going to happen on November 5th is across 50 states, voters will vote each of those 50 states. Each state will pick electors to eventually pick the president of the United States. And to become president of the United States, you have to win 270 electoral votes. That's the most important thing, to get to 270. And because of the way or where people live in the United States, some states like New York have more Democrats than Republicans. Some states like Texas, more Republicans than Democrats. The distribution of Democrats and Republicans is uneven. There's nothing evil or nefarious about this. It's just where people choose to live. And the research that I have done and others have done have pointed out that because of where people live, we more or less have an idea about how 45 states in the United States are going to vote right now. I can tell you, unless something strange happens, New York, California, my state of Minnesota are likely to vote Democrat. States like Texas, Florida, Oklahoma are likely to vote Republican. But we know then, but we know there's about 5 states that are in play. States that could vote Republican or Democrat. We call them swing states. And what we know within those 5 states is that even within those states, there are counties which are small. And I'll get to the third party question in a second here. We get to within each of those 5 states, there's about one county in each state that's really important in the election because how populous that county is. And then, and so what happens in that county is really important. And then within each of those counties, about 5% of the voters really are important. We're so closely in line. Our 2 parties are so competitive, especially in these swing states, that as I describe it, 5% of the voters located in 5 counties in 5 states really will determine how to get to 270 electoral votes and who will win the election. I'll talk more about this in a few minutes here. But we were assuming that it was all about once the conventions were over, we would get down to an election, which was going to really be a battle between the 2 candidates to get to the 270, with the focus being on the 5 states. In the U.S., it is dominated by the Democratic and Republican parties. How realistic is it for third parties to gain significant traction? It's very difficult for a variety of reasons. One of them is because people are so loyal to their party. so loyal to the Democratic or Republican Party, they couldn't think about voting for another candidate. Additionally, that loyalty also means we're pretty politically polarized at this point. And it would be hard for people to be convinced to support a third party candidate, because many people who might say, I really like a third party candidate, but I'm afraid if I vote for that person, the person who I least like will get elected. So there's kind of like that logic there. And then we've got some problems about third parties. The way I describe it, third parties, well, here's my example here. We've got two major soft drinks in the United States, Coke and Pepsi. They dominate the market. I'm going to guess they probably have 80 or 90% market share for soda or for cola. If Schultz, that's my name, if I came up with my own cola and I wanted to compete, how easy do you think it would be for Schultz's cola to compete against Coke and Pepsi? It would be hard. Name recognition, startup costs, all kinds of entry barriers. And that's the problem for third parties. Entry barriers, a lot of different issues here. So a lot of Americans say they would love a third party to emerge, but it's difficult to do so. Okay. So as I said, our Constitution stipulates that presidents are chosen ultimately by the Electoral College. Each state holds elections on November 5th, 2024 to determine which candidate wins its electoral votes. And to become president, one must win 270 electoral votes. I hope again to do a later presentation for you just on the Electoral College. What are the issues that are having the biggest impact in the United States right now? Again, I'll talk more about it later, but I'll mention it now too. I still think it's what we call the pocketbook or economic issues, that when people go to buy food at the grocery store, they're concerned about the cost of food, or they go to fill up the gas tank for their car. They're concerned about that. Right now, a lot of families are getting ready to send their children back to school in about a month. And I suspect the cost of buying children's clothing, so economic issues. Additionally, some of the other issues that are high on the list are what's called abortion or reproductive rights issues regarding whether or not women have a right to terminate a pregnancy, or basically what reproductive rights they have. Clearly, immigration is an issue. Healthcare is an issue. I think national security issues are on the top of the list there. So yes, you've caught this fairly well. And again, I'll mention them again in a few minutes here. Okay. Now, again, if we were to go back about 5 months ago, let's say maybe not even that long, 4 months ago, let's say, or what is it? To May, 3 months ago. I'm forgetting how many months ago it is. If we were to look at public opinion polls, Joe Biden's approval was about 39%. If people were asked the question, do you approve or disapprove of Joe Biden's performance as president, 39% would say they approve. That wasn't very good. It was about where Trump's ratings were 4 years ago. And as a political scientist, I can tell you that in the models that we have done over the years, a low presidential approval rating plus feelings about the economy in the second quarter of an election year are good predictors of elections. When Americans are saying, I'm kind of worried about the economy, I'm worried about how far my money's going to go, et cetera, et cetera. I'm worried about, is the economy going to do well in the future? That's not a good sign. And I suspect this is a problem everywhere in the world, that economic issues are big issues everywhere. No sitting president has won re-election with Biden's numbers, and so things were not looking good for him. And there was concerns about Biden's age, age 82, and concerns about his mental capacities or capability. And this became especially a big factor in the first presidential debate that took place back in June. And we'll get to that in a second here. Okay. As I mentioned to you, in 2024, again, looking ahead, and maybe this slide is out of order, I'm going to argue that the presidential election is going to eventually come down to a few swing voters in a few swing states. If you want to follow what's happening in the United States, these, maybe 5 or 6 states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Wisconsin. These are the 6 swing states. The other 44 states were not because of fraud or anything, but we're pretty sure we know how they're going to vote. And within each of those 6 states, look to see what happens in those counties. And so if you're following American politics, look at these states, look at these counties. Again, as I pointed out to you, I think the election was down to what? 5% of the voters in 5 counties in 5 states get to 270, or maybe 5% of the voters in 6 counties in 6 states, 270. But roughly, you see where I am. Again, back to May. Many Americans were not happy with the state of the American presidential election. That approximately 20% of the voters equally hated or disliked Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Again, it's a term that was circulated this year, the dual haters. And the question is, what were they going to do? I mean, overall, about 60% of the American public was not excited to see a Trump versus Biden rematch. But what we saw was about 20% were saying, I don't like Trump, I don't like Biden. What am I going to do? And even a few months ago, Robert Kennedy Jr., he's the son of Bobby Kennedy, who was a U.S. senator who ran for president in 1968, and he was unfortunately assassinated in a very, very ugly year back in 1968. Robert Kennedy Jr. Is also running as a third party or independent candidate for president, and he's polling at about 20%. And so it's looking like, my gosh, maybe he's an alternative. So the question was a few months ago, back in May, early June, what will the dual haters do? Will they vote for the lesser of the two evils? Will they say, well, I don't like either of them, but I dislike one more than another. I'll vote for the lesser of two evils. Will I stay home, just not vote at all? Or will I vote for RFK Jr.? Since then, RFK Jr.'s support has faded. He's polling at about 5 or 6%. Not going to say he won't be important, but he's certainly not as important or significant as he was a few months ago. But as I want to keep saying, again, this is my field of specialty here on presidential swing states. I'm going to argue that the race is down to about what 150,000 to 200,000 voters actually do in 5 or 6 swing counties. And if the election were proceeding the way we thought it was going to be up until May or early June, it was going to be Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. They were going to get their party nominations. The general election would take place, and the focus would be on these 5 or 6 swing states on roughly 150,000 to 200,000 voters. That's what we all thought was going to happen. And as I said to you, people were not envious of this election. Polls did not favor this lineup. There was, back in June, clear enthusiasm for Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and their party seemed very, very united. But then and prior to June 27th, 2024, which is the first presidential debate, Trump had a slight lead in the critical swing states, and people were thinking he's probably ahead, still too close to call, but we're thinking he might be favored to win re-election. But then on June 27th, there was the first presidential debate. Trump and Biden debated. Biden had a very bad debate performance, and he appeared forgetful. He wandered and so forth. And what this did was to raise concerns about his cognitive capacities and his ability to win. He's 82 years old. And I heard people say, for example, and you probably have family members like this too, who are getting to be older, upper 70s, 80s. I know I had a grandfather like that. He had good days, bad days, forgetful, unforgetful days, and so forth like that. And there were concerns saying, well, maybe Joe Biden is not up to the task of running for president of the United States. The polls, as a result of the debate, showed him going farther behind. In fact, in many of those critical swing states, behind by 6, 7 points. National polls had him behind by 6 or 7. So the Democratic Party is worried, saying he's going to lose. He's going to not be very good. And pressure started to mount for him to exit and give up his candidacy. They couldn't push him out. They couldn't tell Biden, you're out, because he had enough delegates. And I'm going to do it another slide in a second here. He had enough delegates to win the nomination. So the choice was down to him. What was going to happen? It was Biden's choice. Under the Democratic Party rules, the delegates to the national convention that Biden won were pledged to vote for him in the first round of voting under the party rules. So it was all up to Biden. However, if Joe Biden made a decision and said, I'm going to end my candidacy for the presidency and I'm releasing my delegates, if he chose to do that, then the Democrats could be free to pick somebody else. And for approximately, I think about a month, I think it was just about a month, pressure continued to mount on, is he going to stay in? Is he not going to stay in? What's going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. So there was an incredible amount of pressure on him to basically step down. And eventually he did. On July 21st, 2024, Joe Biden did 3 things. He sent out on the social media a letter, and there's a copy of it there. Again, might not be readable here, but it's a copy of it here. He sent out a letter saying, I'm ending my presidential bid, I'm releasing my delegates, and he endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris to replace him. And so a few different things happened here in terms of it. What then happened during the week of July 21st, last week, is that Kamala Harris, and that's her picture right now. Again, she's the current vice president of the United States. She moved incredibly quickly. Within just a matter of days, she received what appeared to be overwhelming support for her candidacy for president of the United States among Democrats. They seem to really like her in terms of running. People like Bill and Hillary Clinton endorsed her campaign. Barack Obama endorsed her campaign. And in less than 48 hours, she raised 100 million US dollars to run for president. And outside groups also raised over $150 million. She brought back enthusiasm to the campaign. So a couple of questions here. For example, someone asking, do you think it's fair for celebrities like Taylor Swift to express their political views, potentially influencing the election? Well, in the United States, anybody really is free to express their views, including movie stars, including famous people. And I'm going to talk about Taylor Swift in a few minutes here also, too, because I think if she were to come out and endorse Kamala Harris, that could have a big impact, because among the people who obviously follow Taylor Swift are young women under the age of 30, maybe even under the age of 25. They generally don't vote in American elections. Not because they can't, but because they're just not likely to vote. But if she were to come out and say, vote for her, I could see something happening where a bunch of women say, young women say, do it for Taylor Swift. So that's a great question here. Whether or not it's appropriate, we just, for these endorsements, we just consider that part of what free speech is about, freedom of association, to be able to do things like that. So Harris right now is consolidating support, appears to be the candidate for the Democratic Party. But remember, She's not yet the official nominee for President of the United States. The Democratic National Convention will start on August 19th or 19 August 2024. That'll take place in Chicago. However, the delegates will begin voting on August 7th. So literally, 8 days from now, it would potentially be official in terms of her nomination. We're all presuming that she's going to be the nominee, but technically not official, excuse me, until the vote has occurred. Remember, Donald Trump did have the convention back in July. He did get the nomination, and J.D. Vance was picked as his vice president. So the Republican side of the ticket appears to be set at this point. Where we are right now is here. Harris has yet to pick her vice presidential candidate. Now, I should first say, what does the vice president officially do? Under the U.S. Constitution, the vice president is considered to be the president or the head of the Senate. And the task of being the head of the Senate is to mostly vote to break ties. But otherwise, there's not a lot of official duties for vice president of the United States. I could spend a lot of time talking all about that, but there's an American joke that says that what mostly vice presidents do is wait around for the president to die and then to take over or to become incapacitated. Or the vice president's job is occasionally to cast votes to break ties in the Senate. But usually vice presidents don't have a lot to do. Okay. But in terms of picking a vice presidential candidate, the conventional wisdom in the United States is that vice presidents matter, that who the president picks as the vice presidential pick really matters. I've studied this. A few other political scientists have studied this. And really, in reality, vice presidents don't matter. In terms of people vote for who the president is of the United States and generally not for the vice president. The one exception was back in 2008 when Republican nominee John McCain picked Sarah Palin to be his vice presidential candidate. And the American public thought that Sarah Palin wasn't qualified to be vice president, and there's some evidence that she hurt him. But otherwise, very little evidence that vice presidents truly matter. But needless to say, conventional wisdom prevails, and people still act as if it does. So conventional wisdom right now is saying the vice president has to be from a swing state, places like perhaps a Michigan, a Colorado, an Arizona, or someplace like that. And because Kamala Harris is female, both Indian and African American, the conventional wisdom is that they need to select somebody who's a white male Caucasian to be the potential vice president for the idea of balancing the ticket or something like that. Right now, the leading contenders for vice president are these individuals. All this is rumor. Nobody knows who she's going to pick. All of this is just political rumor. We can't prove. Senator Kelly from Arizona is on the list. He's a former astronaut. He's in the U.S. Senate. He's a war hero, considered to be pretty important. Secretary of Transportation Peter Buttigieg is on the list. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear. Minnesota Governor, and again, I'm in Minnesota, Tim Walz is being talked about. And then some people have suggested, how about Gretchen Whitmer, who's the governor of Michigan? She was thinking of running for president, but then decided not to. Most people are saying it shouldn't be two females, female president and vice president. My view is I see no reason why you couldn't do that. but it could be somebody completely different. If you were to ask me who my favorites are personally, who I think she should pick, I think it should either be Governor Whitmer or former San Antonio, Texas Mayor Julian Castro. I taught in San Antonio, Texas for years. I knew Julian Castro. He was the mayor of San Antonio. He served in the Obama administration. I personally think he would be very good, but he's not getting much play in terms of it. Okay. So post-convention, let me wrap this up and let's still leave some time, hopefully, for some questions here. I can go beyond the hour benchmark here. Starting in middle to late August, Harris will have the convention. We'll know her vice presidential pick next week. She'll be voted on next week, probably win the nomination. They'll pick the vice president. The convention occurs in August. And then again, sometime end of August, beginning of September, the unofficial start of the general election campaign will happen. The election is on November 5th, 2024. Early voting will start in late September across many states in the United States. Right now, we don't know if Trump and Harris are going to debate. So we're going to see what's going to happen there. But things are going to unfold over the next few weeks. In terms of what could happen, I've been talking about possible October surprises, things that might surprise us in the United States going into the last few weeks that could change a very, very close election. Because right now, where we are in terms of the polling is that Trump and Harris seem to be about even. We're almost back to where we thought we were before the first debate. Trump, as we know, was convicted of 34 felonies in New York State. He's going to face sentencing in October. How might that affect him? This is supposed to be a couple separate things. It's supposed to say medical emergencies for Trump. Remember that Trump is 78 years old. Originally, I was concerned about medical emergencies for Trump and Biden, but could there be something for Trump that might come up? We don't know. The state of the Israel-Gaza war could be an issue. Who knows what's going to happen and where it's going to be by the time we get to election. Campus protests over the war there could be important. International affairs or international conflicts across the world oftentimes become major U.S. issues. The immigration or U.S. southern border, what's happening there. Inflation or the economy, again, remain issues. Could there be some other U.S. Supreme Court or other court decisions that could affect the election, much in the same way that 2 years ago, the Supreme Court's decision about reproductive rights and abortion rights had an impact on the election? What impact might the third-party candidates have, Robert Kennedy Jr. or others, on the election? What if Taylor Swift were to come out and endorse somebody? Likely, if she does it at all, it would be Kamala Harris. And could there be another black swan or some unknown that could impact the election at the last minute? All become possibilities. Just to point out also here, we also have the U.S. congressional elections, all 435 House seats up for election. The election likely will come down to less than 10 to 15 seats that will determine which party has control of the House. 34 U.S. Senate seats up for election. It'll come down to probably 5 to 9 seats. Election right now favors Republicans, but we still don't know at this point. And then I could sort of basically say at this point, if it had remained Biden versus Trump, as I mentioned to you, and I were talking today, it looked like it was going to be Trump beating Biden, but I'm just not sure where it is right now. So I'll say at this point, questions about this topic or anything else that you would like to ask, and then my contact information. I keep a blog, and a couple times a week or once a week, I sort of put on the blog what I think is and talk about what I think are interesting issues. So if you wanted to go to my blog, if you just looked up Schultz's Take Blogspot, you would find me. That's my email address, dschultz@hamline.edu. I'm also on Facebook. LinkedIn, Twitter. Again, I don't know if you are on any of those other accounts uh, to look me up. I also have a Viber account if you wanted to contact me. But if you sent me an email at dschultz@hamline.edu, that would be one of the easiest ways to reach me. Okay, so now my presentation part is done. Do you folks have any other questions you would like to ask me, or observations or things you would like to talk about? And it could be about my presentation, or it could be about, anything else about American politics, or anything you want to ask me. I think I've gotten to all the questions that are there. I'm going to scale back here. What issues? Third party. Confirm. Thank you. Okay, I think I've gotten everything. But I still want to give you folks one more chance here. Does anybody else have any questions or comments or observations for me? If not, I think we're done with today's talk. I really hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, I hope to be able to do a couple more for you before the election is over, maybe even one after the election, and explain everything that's going on. All right. So I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you very much for attending today. And I hope to see all of you someday again, sometime in Moscow. Thank you. Bye.